Hello. In this video, we're going to talk about 3 female poets of classical Sanskrit poetry. And I'm reading them out of the Norton Anthology of World Literature. Now, first off, it's very unusual to have poetry from women in the pre-modern period. Obviously there were female writers, and there have been throughout history. We can go back to ancient Egyptian, even ancient Near Eastern sources, and we can find occasional bits and pieces by women, but by and large, women's writing either was not publicized, was not preserved, or because women were less likely to receive education in most parts of the world throughout most of history, women were less literate, and so there's simply less opportunities for them to have produced. But we have 3 great female poets in the Sanskrit tradition. Now, I want to preface this by saying I don't speak Sanskrit. I don't know that I'm pronouncing these names correctly. This is the pronunciation of someone who has read a name and has very little sense of how Indian names are actually pronounced. So if these are incorrect, I apologize. If you know how they're correctly pronounced and you can give me some sort of pronunciation guide in the comments, I definitely appreciate that. But we have Vikatanitamba, Bhavakadevi, and Vidya, 3 female poets of the Sanskrit era. We're looking at like the 5th through the 7th century here. And I love Sanskrit poetry. Like, it's not something that I've sort of been raised reading because I went to US public schools and then US universities where we don't really read Indian literature all that often. But I've read some Sanskrit poetry and I really, really like it. We have in the Sanskrit poetic tradition what's called subhashita. Again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But basically, according to the Norton introduction here, it means beautifully expressed in language. And basically, these are short poems. They're really more impressionistic almost, or they're vignettes that rely a lot on subtlety and hinting at the sort of deeper play of what's going on. A lot of Sanskrit poems are love poems or erotic poems. And that's what we get with these 3 female poets, at least the 3 poems that the Norton Anthology has reprinted. So with Vikatanitamba, we get this poem. It's number 572 from her book Subhashita Nakosa. That's terrible pronunciation, I'm sure. But it's a candid erotic poem in a way that we don't really get with authors, especially female authors, until the modern era in, say, the Western tradition, European and American poetry. So the poem goes like this. As he came to bed, the knot fell open of itself, the dress held only somehow to my hips by the strands of the loosened girdle. So much I know, my dear, but when within his arms I can't remember who he was or who I was or what we did or how. So it's an interesting poem because, there's this clear erotic component. This is clearly the story of 2 lovers coming together. But we have hinted this deeper psychological experience of sexual passion, particularly in these last 2 lines. But when within his arms, I can't remember who he was or who I was or what we did or how. This idea of like losing oneself in passion, in love. It's dealt with very much in this subtle way at the end of this poem. But again, it's one of the things about subhashita is that they're short. They're very short. They're very concise, and they pack a lot of meaning into a very short space. And so we get that with this poem. With Bhavakadevi, we get the same kind of thing. Again, a kind of love poem, but not sort of glorifying love. This is about the sort of coming together and going apart of lovers. So this is number 646, actually collected in the same book. All three of these poems are collected in the same book. So this is number 646. At first our bodies knew a perfect oneness, but then grew two with you as lover, and I, unhappy I, the loved. Now you are husband, I the wife. What's left except of this, my life? Too hard to break, to reap the bitter fruit, your broken faith. So again, we've got, like, there's clearly layers of story here, layers of experience being condensed into this very, very short package. And it works really well because we can get the sense of the trajectory of this relationship. We can get the sense of how united the speaker of the poem, who's not necessarily Bhavakadevi. We want to make that distinction because in Sanskrit poetry, I get from as I'm understanding it from the introduction of in the Norton Anthology here, you don't write necessarily about one's own experiences. These are not autobiographical, or we want to be careful about how we read them as potentially autobiographical because they're meant to explore experiences at large. They're meant to explore sort of shared experiences. So the speaker of the poem, like, we get the sense of her longing for that connection that she once had with the husband, and it's simply not there. So that experience of loss and bitterness, I mean, that idea of like, what's left except of this, my life, too hard to break, to reap the bitter fruit, your broken faith. The end of the poem, that anger, that resentment at the decline or the loss of this deep emotional connection is really a powerful sentiment. And again, dealt with in this very subtle, concise package. We get the same thing with Vidya. Again, this is an erotic poem, but it's much more subtle than Vikatanitamba's. We don't have the sort of overt sexual imagery here. What we have is implication. So the poem number 807 is, good neighbor wife, I beg you, keep your eye upon my house a moment. The baby's father hates to drink the tasteless water from the well. Better I go then, though alone, to the river bank, dark with tamala trees and thick with canes, which with their sharp and broken stems may scratch my breast. So there's a lot going on here that's interesting. The ostensible reason for the speaker to go to the river is to get better tasting water for her husband, but, one of the things that we know in Sanskrit poetry is that riverbanks are often a place that romantic liaisons occur. And so she's going into this space where illicit love affairs often happen. And this idea of, if there are marks on my body when I come back, it's because of the foliage, it's because of the trees and the reeds and the plants at the river. And this idea is it's a very interesting sort of cover for what she may actually be doing. She may actually be going to have a love affair, an illicit love affair, while she's ostensibly going to get better tasting water for her husband. So again, these are very short. They're very effective, though. This is sort of the heart of Sanskrit poetry, is this idea of building a lot of meaning into short verses, a lot of ideas and a lot of experiences conveyed in these short poems. They pack a lot of punch, and they're really a joy to read.